Over the years, I've learned a lot about BB&T's business practices. I've had a lot of people from BB&T come and speak to my class, a couple in front of me right here, right now. And BB&T has really good business values, and they do what needs to be done to do honorable business. They look after their workers, their customers, their suppliers, and their shareholders. So they do business the way it should be done. And so you say, well, what is that way? What's the way business should be done? Well, today we're going to hear, because our speaker today is Jim Otteson. He's the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair of Business Ethics, Professor of Economics, and Executive Director of the Eudaimonia Institute at Wake Forest University. Received his undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame, PhD from the University of Chicago. Specializes in political economy, political philosophy, business ethics, and the history of economic thought. He's the author of several books, including Adam Smith's Marketplace for Life, Actual Ethics, The End of Socialism, and his most recent books are The Essential Adam Smith and Honorable Business, A Framework for Business in a Just and Humane Society. And it's Honorable Business is a book our reading group just read last night, and we discussed it. And also, he will be signing copies of his books outside after his talk today. So if you want to buy a copy, there will be some outside that you can purchase, and he will sign them for you. It's a great read. The students in the reading group really enjoyed it, so you might want to pick up a copy. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Otteson. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Steve, do I need to do something here for this? Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. This is my first time at the University of Louisville, so thank you very much. Also to the Menard family, BB&T sponsors. I noticed that it says PNC Auditorium over there. Maybe you guys need to step up your game. Thank you very much. So after that great introduction and the pitch for economics, I was not an economics major as an undergraduate, so it's possible to have a relatively successful life even if you don't major in economics, but economics is great. So what I'd like to talk to you about is this topic, honorable business. Actually, my PhD is in philosophy, so it's a strange thing. I have an appointment in a business school. I teach at Wake Forest University. I have an appointment in the business school and in the economics department, and there are not many people who have PhDs in philosophy who teach in business schools or economics departments. In fact, there are about 7 of us, and we all know each other, so there are very few of us. But when I was brought to Wake Forest University, one of the things I teach there in the business school is various courses under the topic of business ethics. So business ethics is one of those things I discovered when I tell people I teach business ethics. You know, you get the kinds of jokes you might imagine. Things like, well, it must be a pretty short class. You know, is that an oxymoron? And there's some reason for that. So I wrote this book called Honorable Business, in part based on my experience with students in the business school. But the first question we might start with is, can there be such a thing as honorable business? And I'll just set the stage here. So this is from 2013, a Salon article, Greed Destroyed Us All. This was after in reference to the economic recession, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Do you all remember that recession? So for the old folks like me in the audience, this is a sobering fact. So freshmen coming into college now have no memory of 9/11. Is that true? 9/11 is not part of their lived memory. It's something, you know, it's like the shooting of John F. Kennedy or something. It's just something that happened in the past. But they do remember the Great Recession. Am I right about that, Sophia? You're a freshman, right? Yeah. So is that true, that you don't really remember 9/11? That's something people talk about, but you have no living memory of it. But you do remember something about the Great Recession. So Salon magazine published this article in 2013 that said it was really greed that caused the Great Recession. I don't find that a particularly enlightening claim to make, that greed caused. I mean, that's a little bit like saying the airplane crash was caused by gravity. You know, there's always greed. That doesn't explain, if that's always there, that doesn't explain very much. But more specifically with business, and more recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I don't know whether you saw this article, business schools have no business in the university. That was in 2018 that came out, February 2018. And even more recently, just last August, the Chronicle of Higher Education published another article, Abolish the Business Major. Anti-intellectual degree programs have no place in colleges. So business has an image problem, not just an image problem, but business education does as well. Now, these two articles in the Chronicle were both written by history professors, not by business professors. But still, it seems like business has a kind of problem. And one of the things that I discovered in teaching business ethics, teaching business students, is that they are often on the defensive. So if you ask them, why are you studying business? They don't like to talk about it. And often it's because when their friends ask them, or other people who study other things, it seems like those are the only two, that's the entire universe of possible responses. If you're going to study business, why would you possibly do that? Only because you want to get a job or you want to make money. What other reason could you possibly have to go into business? Well, do business students want to get a job or make money? Probably. Is that true for all other students as well? Probably, okay. But still, if that's the only reason to go into business, that's not particularly inspiring. Would you agree with that? That's not the most inspiring vision for going into anything, really, just to get a job or just to make money. So is there something more that we can say? Well, let me ask, I'd like to invite you to consider an analogy. Think about these two professions, medicine and business. So both of them are professions. In both cases, you have specialties, you have subspecialties. In both cases, you need to have some technical knowledge that you're going to have to learn in order to do well. In both cases, you might need a lot of experience and training before you're going to do well. So in all those ways, and then one more, if you're successful in either medicine or business, you might make a lot of money. So in all those ways, they're very similar. But think for a second, consider for a second how differently those two professions are viewed by the wider culture. Nobody says to the medical professional, well, now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. But they say that to the business professional, don't they? Have you heard that before, that people should give back? Have you ever thought about that, what that means? Notice that people don't say to business professionals, you should give. They say you should give back. Well, what does that mean they're thinking? I mean, if your mother said to you, hey, you need to give that back, what does that mean you did? That means you took something that didn't belong to you, right? You stole something. Well, is that what people think about business or about people who are successful in business or companies that are successful, that they did something wrong like stealing? Well, my suggestion is, the answer is yes, that is what people think. So if they see somebody who's been very successful in business or a company that's making a lot of money, oftentimes people will think they might not know exactly what you did wrong, but they're pretty sure you did something wrong. Well, so here's my suggestion. If we think about all of the arguments in favor of business or in favor of a commercial society or a market-based society, and then all of the objections to those kinds of practices, and if at the end of the day we think, yeah, you know, business really is something that you need to atone for, it's something you need to make up for afterwards, then my suggestion is not that we should ask business people or businesses to give back. What we should say to them is, don't do it. Right? I mean, think about other areas of your life. If you're about to do something that you're pretty sure you're going to have to make up for afterwards, that's kind of a red flag, isn't it? I mean, there's some general advice in life. If you're about to do something you think, man, I'm going to have to make up for that afterwards, maybe you should rethink doing it. And should we have business schools if it's true that we think business is something you should atone for? I mean, you don't want to have a school in expert thievery. And you don't say to a thief, if somebody's stealing, you don't say to the thief, well, it's fine as long as some of the money you steal you give to good causes, or you give to charity or something. What do you say to a thief? Stop stealing. So if it's true that business really is the sort of thing that you need to make up for afterwards, then I think we should reconsider the entire activity. So let's put it on the other side. If we're going to teach business or ask people or train people to dedicate their lives to business, then there really ought to be a way in which business can be understood, business activity can be understood to be valuable in itself. Not just for what it might do to make up for something afterwards or to give back or anything afterwards, but the activity itself is going to have to be valuable. And if we can't make that case, then maybe we should reconsider the entire enterprise. So I'll just repeat, I'm a philosopher by training. I mentioned something like this when they were interviewing me at Wake Forest in the business school. They hired me anyway. So maybe we can make a case. So what I'd like to try to do today is to see if we can sketch what honorable business might look like. So a way of participating or practicing business such that it provides and creates value in itself. Okay? Okay. So I'm going to borrow a little bit from Aristotle. This won't be too painful, I promise. So this is Aristotle's view. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle said that one of the things that makes human beings unique maybe unique, or at least unusual among creatures on earth, is that they have what he calls a hierarchy of purposes or ends. All that means, a hierarchy, is just a train of ascending purposes or ends. What that means is that you have things you're doing today, you want to accomplish today. Those are in the service of things you'd like to accomplish in a week or a month or a year or 5 years. And those things themselves are in the service of some final end or some ultimate goal that you want to achieve. So your proximate or near-term ends lead to intermediate ends, which lead to ultimate ends or final ends, the last thing, the most important thing, the thing for the sake of which you do everything else. Here is Aristotle's word for that. This is what Professor Goman mentioned. Aristotle's word for the final end, the highest good, the good for the sake of which everything else you do in life, or human beings do in life, is Eudaimonia. That's just a transliteration of the Greek word, Eudaimonia. It's hard to translate. It's often translated, maybe some of you have seen the word before, or you've read some Aristotle. What is that word? It's often translated as happiness, but it's a little deeper than what we might mean by the English word happiness now. So happiness, if you use it now, it might just mean contentment, or it could mean pleasure or something. It's something deeper for Aristotle. Here's the idea. If you think about, and I invite you to do this while I describe it, you can do it on your own. Imagine yourself at the end of your life. So imagine yourself at the age of 120, looking back on the life that you led. Ask yourself, what kind of life will you then want to have led, such that you yourself would say that was a life worth having been led? A life where you used all of the skills and abilities and opportunities that you had in your life, and you put them in the service of ends or goals that you think were worthy ends and goals. If you ask yourself what kind of a life, so if you actually go through that exercise and try to imagine it, then the idea is you just reverse engineer. So you imagine what kind of life that would be at the end, and then you figure out, well, what do I need to be doing 20 years from now in order to achieve that? And then 10 years from now, and then a month from now, and then right now. And if you can do that, you can achieve what Aristotle called a rationally ordered moral life. So you figure out what the best life for you at the end of it would be, and you just reverse engineer all the way back to today, to the daily activities you're engaged in right now. Now, we might change our mind, and we make mistakes. There's no question about that. But you stand a much better chance of actually achieving this kind of eudaimonic life if you actually think about it now, as opposed to just doing whatever comes along. So we have to connect our daily practice to our proper ultimate end, and that is this idea of a fully flourishing eudaimonic life. Okay, so how does that relate to business? Let me relate that back to business, potentially. What I think that means is that honorable business should fit into a certain kind of context that's going to be similar to that hierarchy of ends. So here's my suggestion. They're just 5 steps, and I don't think the first 2 are particularly controversial. Here's the first one. At the highest level, we all want a just and humane society. Wherever we are on the political or economic spectrum, everybody wants a just and humane society, a society that respects the rules of justice and treats people humanely. Now, I haven't exactly defined what a just and humane society is, of course, and maybe people have different ideas about what exactly that would be. Fair enough. For the sake of argument, I propose that I mean whatever you mean by that. So I want to try to get off the ground. If we're going to disagree with this on stage 1, we'll never get anywhere. I don't think the second one is the second step is controversial either. A just and humane society depends on a variety of institutions. Political institutions, you have to get the right political institutions, economic institutions, maybe moral and cultural institutions. So there's a variety of public social institutions that are required in order to achieve a just and humane society. So I don't think that's too controversial, okay, if you're willing to go along so far. I think step 3 might be more controversial. There are only 5. So here's step 3. I suggest that among those institutions that are required is a properly functioning market economy. Now, that's more controversial. And if you look at that sentence, there's one word in that sentence that's doing a lot of work, isn't there? So the philosophers among you, what's the word you want to know what it means? Properly. What exactly is properly functioning market economy? Okay, now I could weasel out of it and just say, oh, well, a properly functioning market economy is one that's part of the institutions that contributes to a humane and just society. Okay, but that wouldn't tell us very much. So let me tell you a little bit more. Step 4, a properly functioning market economy depends on honorable business. Okay, so now what do you want to know? What is honorable business? Okay, and here's step 5, last step. Honorable business is industries, firms, individuals creating genuine value. And what I mean by that is making their own lives better, improving their own lives, only if at the same time they're improving other people's lives as well. Now when I say value, that doesn't necessarily mean just economic or monetary value. That could be moral value too. So by value, what I mean is the things that matter to people. If you're contributing to improving your own life according to all of the things that matter to you, but only if at the same time you're creating value for others, for whatever matters to them, that's honorable business. So my suggestion is that business people and firms who create value are contributing to this hierarchy of purpose. If we're doing it right, so here's your first in-class quiz. If we're doing it right, there's only one way you can achieve eudaimonia, or happiness if you like, for yourself. If we have the right institutions that contribute to a just and humane society, there's only one way to achieve happiness for yourself. What is it? Somebody tell us. We're not doing well on your in-class quiz here, Professor Goman. Happiness for yourself only by serving others. Does that make sense? If you're doing it right, that's the only way that you can achieve genuine happiness for yourself. Okay, so this is just to show you that I know how to use PowerPoint. This was one of the skills I had to develop teaching in a business school. I didn't use PowerPoint before I taught in a business school, but this is the thing that business professors do. But this is just to show you that these are connected. So what is this supposed to mean? So I would consider it a win, a victory, if a student comes through business school and at the end of the program gets a job working at wherever the job is, Deloitte or Thomson Reuters or BB&T. And if somebody says to that student, well, what are you going to be doing at BB&T? I would consider it a victory if the student responded, oh, I'm contributing to a just and humane society. And if somebody says, well, what do you mean by that? Well, give me 2 minutes and I'll explain it to you. I'm engaging in honorable business, which is part of a properly functioning market economy, which is part of the institutions that lead to a just and humane society. Okay, so that's a bit of a sketch of what I have in mind, but let me fill it out just a little bit and maybe motivate it. Why should we talk about this? Now, there are not many opportunities in business education. Those of you who are business students are probably aware of this. There aren't many classes that talk about, what's the moral purpose or any purpose of business. There just aren't many classes like that. And that's for good reason. If you're going to be if you're going to major in business, there's a lot of technical knowledge you need to learn: marketing, accounting, finance, etc. So why should we bother thinking about this? Well, because I think it does matter, and this is one way to think about it mattering. So let me tell you what, even philosophers can make graphs too. Let me tell you what you're looking at there. This is the last 12,000 years of human existence, and that's the total wealth in constant purchasing power parity dollars, international dollars, total wealth created by the world divided by the number of people alive at the time. So these are two different economists who calculated this. One is, the blue line is Angus Madison, who died a few years ago, should have won the Nobel Prize for this. He calculated this all the way back to year 1. The red line is by Brad DeLong, who is at Berkeley, he's an economist at Berkeley, who calculated this back to 12,000 years ago. In fact, he thinks we can make estimates going back to 1 million years ago. That's a bit sketchy. So early hominids on the planet, I'm not so sure about that. But we do have fairly good indicators going back to about 12,000 years ago. But if you look at a graph like that, you're a social scientist, you look at a graph like that, what's the part of it that jumps out at you? Which part of that graph do we need to explain? I mean, that's quite a hockey stick, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Something happened, so what do you want to explain? This. What changed? So this is 12,000 years on the planet. Has human biology changed over 12,000 years? No. If you brought a child, if you could transport a child from 10,000 BC to Louisville today, what would that child be doing? Playing Fortnite like the rest of you. I mean, you would not notice any difference. It'd be biologically, psychologically exactly the same. So what else has changed? Has climate changed? Yep. Has the Earth gotten warmer and colder over those 12,000 years? Yep. Didn't make any difference. Think about some of the great civilizations of the past. Think about the Egyptian pharaohs when they were building their pyramids. That took a lot of capital to build those pyramids. Not a blip. No change. Think about the great Roman Empire. Not a blip. No change. Think about the Song dynasty in China, the great Song dynasty in China, which had, by the way, philosophy and literature and science. They had gunpowder. Nothing. So what changed? Something dramatic happened. If it's not biological, psychological, climatological, something else changed. What is it? So you and I, ladies and gentlemen, are lucky, blessed, to be living at a time when there is more wealth in the world than there has ever been in the history of humanity. Sometimes we don't appreciate that, but for almost all of human history, there was no change. People did not move far from wherever the physical place was where they were born. Life expectancy was not very great. They weren't waiting for the next iPhone to come out and getting irritated if it takes more than 6 months. There were no changes, and then something happened. So my question is, what? Now maybe you have some theories about it. Are you starting to think about what might be the change? Let me just tell you before I ask your theory about it or what your ideas about it. How big has the transformation been? So this transformation, what the economist Deirdre McCloskey calls the great enrichment. The Nobel laureate Angus Deaton calls it the great escape from poverty. So how big has this change been? Well, maybe some of you have you heard of this? You've heard of Thomas Hobbes in the book he wrote called Leviathan. This is one of the famous quotes, not just from that book, but in the history of political thought. Life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Well, in 1651, that's pretty much what life was. In fact, up until about 1800 or so, there was really no change. So the average person in 1800 was no better off than the average person 100,000 years ago. Life for humanity was basically the same. It didn't change. For each individual, they lived on between $1 and $3 per person per day for almost all of human history. That's attempting to have purchasing power parity, constant dollars. Now just think about that for a second. Could you live, let's be generous, could you live on $3 per day for everything? Food, clothing, shelter, graduate school, everything? Maybe. Wouldn't be easy. You better hope you don't get sick, break a bone, or get an infection. But what is it like today? The world today, in, again, constant dollars, $48 per person per day. In the United States, it's $164 of wealth per person per day. So that means we have a 16-fold increase worldwide and a 55-fold increase in America. So that's a pretty big change. I just give you this to emphasize how big this change has been and how recent. It's just been in the last 1% of human existence. So something dramatic changed. So I'll ask the question again, what caused it? So I'm going to give you my own view about it, and I'll preface it by saying there are people all over there are Nobel laureates on various sides of this issue, so it's not settled. There's no disagreement. There's a consensus about the fact that there was this change. Not a lot of consensus yet about what caused the change or why it began to change. So I want to give you what my theory is or my hypothesis is. It's this. There was a change in morality, which led to a change in culture, which led then to a change in institutions. And it went in that order. There was a change in morality first, institutions followed afterwards. And let me illustrate this by means of an example. Sophia, is it okay if I use you as an example? So I don't know if you can see this. So Sophia's a student here, and she has a beautiful laptop. Can you show everybody that laptop? See your nice laptop? Suppose I wanted to have that laptop. So suppose there is somebody else has something you want. It could be anything. It could be their labor. You want them to work for you. It could be their love. You want to get married to them. It could be a laptop. There are really two ways that you could get it. So there are two ways I could get that laptop from Sophia, aren't there? What are the two ways I could get that from her? Buy it or steal it. Okay. Let the record show that somebody over here said steal it first. What's your major? You have some work to do, Professor Goldman. So, okay, so let's start with that before we come to your suggestion. So one way is I could steal it, right? I could take it when she's not looking, assault her and take it from her. I could defraud it out of her. I could say, I'll give you $10,000 for it next week, and you believe me for some reason, and then you give it to me, and I just head off back to North Carolina or something and don't give it. So that's one set of ways. Theft, fraud, etc. And what's the other way? I think it was you who said that, right? Yeah, the other way is I could make her an offer, which she's free to accept or not. And if she accepts it, then so I don't know what it would be. How much would you want for that thing?
Like $900. I just got it, basically.
$900. All right. So if I offered you $1,000, you would take it. I'm not actually offering you $1,000 for the lawyers in the audience. Okay, so suppose I offered her $1,000. She said yes. She gave it to me, and I gave you the $1,000. That's the other way you could get it. Those are the two principal ways to get those things. What should we call the first? So I propose to call the first extraction. Extraction is one way to get something from another person or from other people. That's theft, slavery, imperialism, fraud. What's the other way? I would call it cooperation. That's mutually voluntary exchange, partnership, association, etc. Now, what's the key difference between those two? There are actually two. One is, the first one is not voluntary. The people you steal from didn't say yes. The second one is voluntary. When you exchange voluntarily, then they said yes. All parties to the exchange said yes. What's the other one? There's another key difference, and this is part of the explanation for that big hockey stick I showed you before. Which one of them leads to increasing prosperity? So if I steal Sophia's laptop, who benefits from that exchange? I don't know if that's an exchange, but who benefits from it? I do, right? Plus one laptop for me, minus one laptop for her. What's plus one plus minus one? Zero. So economists call that a zero-sum exchange. That's not increasing the wealth. That's not increasing prosperity. It's just moving it from one place to another. Why was that long, low red line throughout all of human history? Why was it so low and so consistent? Because that's the main way that human beings got what they wanted from other people. As soon as one person or one group gets enough power over another person or another group, what have they done historically? They attack them. They steal their stuff. That's not creating new wealth. That's just moving it around. How did the pharaohs get all that capital to build the pyramids? How did they, by the way? Slavery. Yeah, they enslaved people. That's extraction. That's not creating new wealth. That's stealing the labor and lives of other people for your benefit. So one side benefits, but only at the expense of the other side. So think about the other one, the cooperative exchange. If I give you $1,000 and you give me your laptop, now which of us benefits from that exchange? We both do. Right? Is that right? We both do, and we know that that has to be the case. Why? Because if Sophia didn't think she would benefit from that, if I offered her $50 for that, what would she say? No thanks, and go away. If she said to me, I'm happy to give you my laptop for $10,000, what would I say? No thanks, and go away. So if both of us said yes, that must mean that each of us thinks we benefit from the exchange, meaning that whatever we're giving up for it is less to us than whatever we got we're giving. So whatever we're getting exceeds whatever we gave up for it. So in that case, it's not a zero-sum exchange, but what do we call it? Positive value for me, positive value for her, positive plus a positive is positive sum exchange. That's what began to happen. So what began to change? Let me ask you that question. Between extraction and cooperation, which one of those is more moral? Yeah, that's not supposed to be a hard question. That seems obvious, right? Does anybody want to dispute that? That's cooperation is more moral because you're giving another person, you're treating them like a moral agent, giving them the opportunity to say yes or no. Here's the more interesting question, or not more interesting, but it's interesting that it connects. Which one leads to increasing prosperity? Same one. That, I think, begins to explain that hockey stick, what began to go up. Because what began to change in some places, in some people's minds, is the idea that extraction was not a good way to deal with other people. They began to change their mind for moral reasons, that the right way to deal with other people is through cooperation rather than extraction. Now, not everybody changed their mind at the same time. It was a few people started making the argument in the 16th century, a few more in the 17th century. By the time you got to the 18th century, it was beginning to spread, and that led to, as the more you have those positive sum cooperative relationships, the more they engender, and then it's like the miracle of compounding interest. It builds on itself, and that's what creates that hockey stick. Now this is what my connection is to business. What I'd like to suggest to you to think about is that cooperative business is honorable business. And that connects to that hierarchy that I suggested before. Now I gave you some historical evidence. Is there contemporary evidence linking markets and what I call honorable business and human well-being? I just give you a little bit. We don't want to spend too much time on that, but I'll give you a little bit of this. How much time do we have? A little bit. So there's this team of economists, there are actually several teams of economists that have been doing this for several years now, for a few decades now. They rank countries, or rank places on the extent to which their economies are market-based economies or non-market-based economies. So the more market-based your economy is, the higher you are in the ranking. The less market-based your economy is, the lower it is in the ranking. One of these groups is called, from the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian think tank, a team of international economists. They've been putting this out every year now. They began in 1975, but I'll give you the most recent. So they rank now, the most recent ranking is the one I'm going to show you. It's 162 countries they look at. They were able to get data about 162 countries around the world. Anybody want to guess which country in the world has the most market-based economy in the world? Good guess. Not Singapore. Not Japan. Close. Not Taiwan. Not China. What is it? Hong Kong. Hong Kong's number one. Now we'll see what happens in the future with Hong Kong. But at the moment, and in fact Hong Kong has been number one ever since they began doing this. So it started in 1975. So all the way to today, Hong Kong has been number one. They just rated on a scale from 0 to 10. So there you see the top 10. You see the United States is at number 6. Canada's number 10. I don't know if there are any surprises or many surprises in there. Just for completeness sake, I'll show you the bottom 10. Anybody want to take a guess at what the least free economy is in the world? So I heard North Korea, Venezuela. Any other guesses? Cuba. Okay, those are good guesses. Myanmar. So here's the bottom 10. There you see Venezuela is 162. By the way, did you see, just so you see the numbers, Hong Kong is nearly 9 out of 10. The top 10 are between about 8 and 9. And then when you look at the bottom 10, all the way down to 2.8, so or a little bit below 3. So that's the bottom 10. These are the least market-based economies. They do not rank North Korea and Cuba. And the reason they don't rank North Korea and Cuba is because this group of economists only ranks countries for which they can get independently verifiable data. And neither North Korea nor Cuba give independent, they make claims. So Cuba claims that in fact North Korea claims that every year its annual economic growth is about 7%. No, it's not. They're just making that up. But they don't allow people to independently verify it, so they just keep them out. But they would be near the bottom of the list as well. Okay, so maybe that's interesting just to know where countries stand on this ranking. But for my purposes, or for my interests, what's more interesting is to know how are citizens doing in these countries. Are there ways that we can measure human well-being and then see how it matches up with this? So that's what I'd like to show you. So let's think first of all about wealth. This probably doesn't surprise you. So what I've done now is just broken the 162 countries into quartiles, so about 40 countries in each group. The most market-based, second, third, and least. And there you can see the difference in, again, constant dollars is a little bit over 7 times. So the per capita income is about 7 times as high in the freest countries, the most market-based economies, as it is in the least. That probably doesn't surprise you very much. But what about the poor? Suppose we took the poorest 10% from all of those countries, from number 1 through 162, and looked only at them. What would you expect to see? I'll show you. There it is. So you see something very similar. The difference between the poorest 10% living in the least market-based economies and those in the most marketplace, that's actually a typo. It's eightfold, nearly eightfold. In other words, and again, this is in constant dollars. In other words, if you're unlucky enough to be in the lowest 10% of your country's income, you're a heck of a lot better over here than you are over there. That level, I don't know if you can see it, $1,345 per person per year. What is that equal to? About that long, low red line. That's what that represents. So are there people in the world who are still at that level? Yes, there are. How many is it? Well, it's about 700 million or so, depending on who you're talking to or who's calculating, about 700 million people in the world that are still at that historical level of, it's approximately what the UN calls absolute poverty. That's the bad news. The good news is there are about 7 billion people who've risen above that for the first time in human history. So I think the work that remains to be done is to see how we can get the rest of them to come up as well. Okay, but that's wealth and money. Is wealth the only thing that matters? Is money the only thing that matters in life? Some of you are not so sure. So here's my answer. No, money's not the only thing in life, but here's what I would say. Maybe this is what you were thinking. What I think wealth can do is help enable the things that do matter in life. If I'm so poor that I don't know whether I can eat today, or I don't know whether my children can eat today, then what am I not doing? I'm not thinking about writing the great American novel or going to graduate school or traveling abroad for time. And what I'm thinking about is, can my children eat today? So what wealth can do is help us address those more immediate pressing concerns, food, clothing, and shelter, so that we can begin to turn our attention to the other things that go into making a fully flourishing life. So wealth is not the only thing that's important in life, but it can enable some of the things that are more important in life. And it turns out that markets correlate not just with wealth, as I mentioned, but with virtually every way we've been able to come up with to measure human well-being. So these are among them. So the more market-based your country's economy is, the more highly you score on all of these criteria. And that's with statistical significance. So my institute at Wake Forest, called the Eudaimonia Institute, one of the things we do is try to measure these things. We try to figure out what can we measure that actually gets at human well-being, and it's hard to, you can't measure well-being directly, but you look at things that might be proxies for it. These are among the things we look at. In all of these ways, they all point in the same direction. Now, have you heard the phrase, correlation is not causation? Yeah, so these are correlations. They're not causal relations, or we're not able to know directly. You can't put human beings in controlled experiments. They don't like that. So we have to look at proxies. And if we had only one or two of these, or if they pointed in different directions, we might not be able to conclude very much. But when you have this many variables that all point in the same direction, that begins to look like you're onto something. So my argument would be that what it does at the least, if it doesn't make a decisive case, it does shift the burden of proof. If you're skeptical that markets correlate, or maybe even allow increases in well-being, then you have to explain all of this data away, and there's more of it coming all the time. Okay, so if markets are so wonderful, honorable business is so wonderful, does that mean it doesn't have any problems? No. So let me just mention two. I'll close with just mentioning two potential problems. One is fairness. So there's a position in moral philosophy called luck egalitarianism. Maybe some of you have heard this. Has anybody heard that phrase before? Luck egalitarianism? It's a mouthful. All it means is this. Does luck play a role in people's lives? Yes. Are some people who are successful because of lucky breaks they got? Yes. Maybe they had good parents, or they had a family that loved them, or they grew up in a place that nurtured them, or they were able to go to good schools, or you had the opportunity to study with Professor Goman. And it's all just luck for you. Similarly, other people who've had bad luck. who grew up in not loving homes or in places that were war-torn? It's a yes. So the lucky egalitarian says that, well, whatever level of success you had in life, if some of it was due to good luck, or if you had less success and that was due at least in part to bad luck, by definition, that's outside of your control. So maybe what we should do is try to equalize the effects of luck by redistributing some of the success of the people who've had good luck to the people who've had bad luck. Does that make sense? That's the lucky egalitarian position. It just seems like a moral claim. You can't claim to deserve things that you got just because of luck, whether good or bad. Okay? And a system that rewards luck is a system that's unfair. So I'm going to try to be as provocative and maybe even offensive as possible here for a second. So I'm going to try to make an argument about this. I'm going to give you a reason to think that this might not be crazy, but before I do that, I want to make sure we understand what it is I'm arguing for. Here's my proposition. If you have undeserved bad luck in life, so you had bad luck and even assume it wasn't your fault, it's undeserved bad luck, and you had disappointment because things didn't turn out well for you because of the bad luck, and we all agree that your disappointment was reasonable, if you had both of those, it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody owes you anything. All right, let that sink in for a second. So there are some people who think if you had one or the other, if you had undeserved bad luck or reasonable disappointment, then maybe you're owed something. I want to take the harder case. Even if you had both, it doesn't necessarily, by itself, mean anybody owes you anything. Okay, so that's the proposition. Here's my, my scenario to illustrate it. I want you to consider the case of two economics majors at Wake Forest University. We'll call them Jack and Jill to protect the innocent. They were seniors in March of their senior year. They'd been dating for some time. Jill was starting to think that Jack was the one for her, and Jack was starting to think that maybe Jill was the one for him. And so they were starting to have thoughts about, well, should we coordinate, what we're going to do when we graduate, what's going to happen if we get jobs in different cities. They were starting to think about this. One Sunday night, Jack calls Jill and says, hey, Jill, I'd like to take you out to dinner next Saturday night. And she says, great. And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, it's going to be special? And he says, it's going to be special. Okay, so she hangs up the phone and she says to her roommates, hey, Jack just asked me to dinner next Saturday night. He said it's going to be special. You don't think he's going to ask me to marry him, do you? And they said, he is totally going to ask you to marry him. So she starts thinking about this. What if he asked me to marry him? What am I going to do? Well, she thinks about it, and she writes her name on Mrs. Jack on things and decides, yep, if Jack asks me to marry him, I'm going to say yes. Okay, that's what she decides. That's Sunday night. Right after she hung up the phone, Jack called a restaurant and said, I'd like to make a reservation for 2. I'm going to bring my girlfriend to dinner. I'm going to ask her to marry me. And they said, oh, that's fantastic and wonderful. We'll have flowers, and there'll be somebody playing with a violin. It'll be beautiful and wonderful. He says, great. Now it's Monday morning. Monday morning, Jill is in class with an unnamed professor, Professor Otteson, and she's not really paying attention because she's thinking about whatever might be happening on the upcoming Saturday night. Jack, for his part, is not in class. He's at a jewelry store using his student loan money to buy no, I'm kidding. Do not use your student loan money. But he bought an engagement ring for her instead of going to class. After class is over, Jill's on her way out, and she gets stopped by a student in the class named Joe. Now, who's Joe? Well, Joe's a kid who's been in the class the whole semester. She hadn't really paid much attention or noticed him. On this day, for some strange reason, he said, hey, Jill, did you happen to hear what the professor said at the end of class? And she said, oh, I don't know, let me check my notes. So she looks at her notes, and she looks at Joe, and their eyes meet, and there's a spark. So they chat for a little while, and Joe says, hey, you want to go get a cup of coffee or something? And she says, oh, yeah, I had a midterm exam review session, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Yeah, let's go get a cup of coffee. So they went and got a cup of coffee, and they talked, and they spent the entire afternoon talking. Now it was evening, and it was dinner time, and Joe said, oh my gosh, time sure has flown with you. You want to get a bite to eat? And she says, oh my gosh, I can't believe how late it is. I was supposed to visit my grandmother in intensive care. I'm sure she's fine. Yeah, let's go get a bite to eat. So they went and got a bite to eat. They walked around the quad. They talked. They spent all night talking to each other. Now it's Tuesday morning. The sun is coming up over campus. Joe looks at the sun. He looks at Jill. He says, Jill, I've never met anybody like you before, and I can't believe what I'm feeling right now, and I can't believe what I'm about to say, but Jill, marry me. Right now, let's elope, let's go to a justice of the peace right now and get married. Suddenly, Jill snaps back from wherever she had been and realizes that she spent almost an entire day with someone who was a virtual stranger. She looks at her phone and she has 87 texts from Jack. Do you remember him? Where are you? What happened to you? Why aren't you responding to my texts? Her thoughts start flying, and while she's thinking about all of these things, she looks at Joe and says, yes. And they go right that afternoon and get married. Okay? So there's my scenario. You can just think about that for a second. Now let me ask you this question. Do you remember Jack? Did Jack have some undeserved bad luck? That seems like kind of bad luck, doesn't it? The week you were going to ask your longtime girlfriend to marry you, she happens to run into some stranger and decides to elope? Seems like bad luck. If Jack is disappointed, would you agree that that seems reasonable? Okay, so my question is, what should we do about it? Should Jack be able to sue Jill for the 9 children he wanted her to bear him one day and now he won't? No. How about for all of the love and affection he anticipated getting from her over the years of their marriage that he now will not get? Should he be able to sue her for compensation for that? No. For the loss of the investment of time and energy he put into the relationship, which suddenly went, no, sorry. And why not? And it's crucial to answer why not. Why doesn't he get to sue her for those things? Because Jill is a free person who gets to decide to whom to give or from whom to not give her affection, love, time, etc. Even if that means it arose from bad luck, even if it means somebody's going to be disappointed. So what can we do about it? If you're a friend of Jack's, okay, you take him out for a beer and you say, dude, that was a bummer. Yeah, that's fine. You introduce him, let me introduce you to Jenny, or let me introduce you to Jerry, or whatever. All of that's fine. What can't you do? You can't visit a cost or injury on Jill. So my suggestion is that the same thing happens in markets. If you own a coffee shop and I go to your coffee shop every day and suddenly a coffee shop opens up across the street and I decide I like that one better and I stop going to yours and I go to that one, and maybe all your customers go to that other one, do you have a right to compensation? The answer is no, because you have no more right to your patrons than Jack had to Jill. Okay, one last one, very quickly. I'm going to give you a thought experiment. Are you worried about inequality? Do market economies give rise to inequality? Yes. Should we worry about it? Should the principles of justice address material inequality, so differences in wealth or differences in income? Let me just give you a quick thought experiment. Suppose you have 2 people. One is much wealthier than the other. Let's say A is 100 times wealthier than B. Now here's my question, just a thought experiment. My question to you, if you know nothing else about them, didn't tell you who they are or anything about them, do you think there must be something wrong with a society in which it's possible for one person to be worth 100 times what another person is worth? In other words, do you think that such a society must have some failure in justice, or perhaps social justice, if you prefer that term? I want you to think about that on your own. Let me tell you who my A and B are. You ready for my A and B? Here's my A. There he is. Recognize him? Who's that? It's Bill Gates saying, thank God I live in a capitalist society, or whatever he's saying. What's Bill Gates worth? So it goes up and down with market returns. Microsoft recently had a pretty good report. I checked this morning. He's worth about $110 billion. As of today, about $110 billion. It goes up and down with the price of Microsoft, but what's a billion among friends? We'll say it's $110 billion. So who's a person who has to struggle in life worth only 1/100th of Bill Gates' wealth? And there are lots of people I could pick. I decided to pick a neighbor of mine. You recognize him? Who's that? Did you say T-Pain? Oh my God. T-Pain. It's Michael Jordan. Okay, he's not actually a neighbor. He does live in North Carolina. I've never met him. He's not really my neighbor. But in the interest to show you I'm not totally unhip and old so I'll give you somebody else if you prefer. Who's that? Who is that? That is not T-Pain. That is somebody named Kylie Jenner. Kylie Jenner is the youngest self-made billionaire in history. She is 21 years old and she's worth $1.2 billion. Okay, so these are extreme examples, but this is what I would suggest. What matters morally is not just does somebody have more wealth than another person, but these two questions. How did the wealthier person get it? Did you get it through force, fraud, theft, or other means of extraction? Okay, that changes everything. Or the poorer person, what's the absolute quality of life? Kylie, not Kardashian, Jenner, right? Yeah. Kylie Jenner is worth only a tiny fraction of Bill Gates, but she's doing, I think, all right by objective standards. So the absolute quality matters. But what if we had more extreme wealth differentials? Are there people in the United States who have not 100 times more than others, but 1,000 times more? Yes. How about 10,000 times? Yes. How about, raise it another order of magnitude, 100,000 times? Yes. And we could keep going. Let's double it even more. Think about somebody who has only 1/250,000th of Bill Gates' wealth, a tiny, tiny fraction of Bill Gates' wealth. Now, who is that poor soul who has to suffer through life? That's me. Actually, I'm rounding up. Okay, so what is that supposed to show? I think it shows this, and I would leave you with this final question to think about on this topic. If you could change one thing about the world, but only one thing, either poverty or inequality, in other words, if you could get rid of poverty in the world or you could get rid of inequality, which would you choose? And I think the answer, your answer, whatever your answer to that question is, might tell you something about the system of political economy you might endorse. But I won't be cagey about it. For me, I'll tell you what my answer is. I'm happy to talk about this more, but my answer is poverty. Because I think poverty is the source of far greater misery and suffering in the world than inequality is. That's not to say that inequality doesn't cause problems. It does. But they're not as great as the problems that absolute poverty continues to create in the world. Okay, let me go to my conclusion. So here's what I would like to suggest tonight. What I call cooperative exchange within market, not extractive institutions, generates increasing wealth, but it leads to a lot of other benefits too, those benefits among which those benefits that I listed. But it also enables this, and this is something I didn't touch on so much, but I think it's implicit in the discussion that we had with Sophia and her laptop. What happens in cooperative business is that each of us retains an opt-out option, the right to say no thank you and go somewhere else. If everybody has the right to say no thank you to any offer, proposal, demand, or anything else, to say no thank you and go elsewhere, then if I want to exchange with you or partner with you or have you work for me or have you be a customer or a client of mine, who do I have to think about? You. I have to think about what can I provide you. If I'm only thinking about what can I do for myself, I'm going to go out of business. I have to think about you, which means this means I have to show you respect for what you want and what you desire and what your goals in life are. So I think that generates mutual respect. So cooperative exchange and what I'm calling honorable business, I think can lead to both prosperity and morality. And so understood, could perhaps honorable business, defined as I've defined it, actually be a moral calling. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions. The microphone. If you have questions, please stand up and ask them. A lot of students have classes right now. So.
Yeah, I understand. I understand.
Hopefully somebody else will.
It's kind of intimidating to have to go to the microphone to ask a question.
Yeah. What? Do you have any questions? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. Hello, Jim. just wanted to ask, when it came to just because most people that write books always have like kind of like just a sparking of an idea. Could you at least, if you have one, that is, tell us what kind of sparked that idea to just come up with a book?
To write the book in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did have a spark. I guess the main spark for me was my dismay at discovering how so many business students feel defensive about studying business. They feel sort of dirty about studying business, and I thought that that seemed not right to me. That if it was really something dirty, we shouldn't do it. You should go do something else. And that's a general piece of advice, so forgive me for giving a general piece of advice, but I say this to students and young people all the time. If you're about to do something, but you feel kind of dirty before you do it, don't do it. That's a red flag, don't do it. But I thought that there was a way to describe the purpose, or at least a purpose that business could serve, for which people wouldn't feel guilty or defensive about it if you gave them a positive case for not what all business does. There's plenty of bad action in business. There are bad actors in business. There are bad actors in all walks of life. But it is also possible to engage in business in what I think is an honorable fashion. And so the main reason to write the book was to spell out what I thought that could be, so that students who want to be honorable business people would have a way of understanding what they're doing and feeling proud about it.
Thank you. Also, could I just give a quick suggestion just to improve the speech?
Okay. Yes.
It's not at all offensive. It's just a general
You don't like my
suggestion.
tie?
Basically, I highly suggest not using the pyramids example because
why is that?
historical consensus is that no, it actually wasn't slaves. It was actually laborers and stuff like that.
I'm aware of that view, but I wouldn't call that historical consensus. So that is a view, but it's a minority view.
Mm-hmm. But
it's certainly possible.
I just searched up Egyptian slaves on Google, and there was every source said no. From National Geographic to Reuters.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, but I am aware of the controversy.
We have historical graves where those same laborers were honored by being next to those same pyramids. So yeah.
I'm aware of, and I appreciate the suggestion. So maybe we can be friends by saying the Roman Empire is better? Okay. Yes. Oh, yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Thank you so much for being with us here tonight. So I actually am part of the reading group that read your book as well.
Thank you.
We had the section on corporate social responsibility. So I was just curious how corporate social responsibility, even if it achieves a positive social goal, yet there may be some zero sum or extraction used along the way. Or fraud or anything, if it still achieves a favorable or a positive goal, is it still fraud or is it still a negative interaction? Would it be able to be considered honorable business?
If it's engaging in fraud or?
No, if it's deception but not fraud.
It's deception, not fraud.
It's kind of hard.
So it's maybe if I understand your question correctly, is it?
Yes.
So suppose I'm the CEO of a large company, and I say we want to engage in various social justice activities, corporately socially responsible activities, and I say the reason we're doing it is because we think it's the right thing to do. But in fact, the reason I'm doing it is because I think I'm going to get more customers or clients, or my bottom line is going to increase, something like that.
Yes.
So maybe there's a good end that I'm serving, but for the wrong reasons. Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. So is that deceptive? Yes. And I think people should be open and honest about it. But one reason I talk about honorable business, I do talk about corporate social responsibility in the book, as I guess you saw. But I think when you have a discussion of business activity and asking whether businesses should engage in corporate socially responsible activity, that pits exactly the same dynamic or dilemma that I was suggesting at the beginning, which is the wrong way to think about business. That makes it sound as if business activity is inherently bad and we need to figure out something they can do to atone for it. And there is some business practice and activity and business people for whom that is exactly the case. That's true. But what I would like to argue, and what I hope can be the case, is that there is a way of engaging in honorable business such that the activity itself actually is improving the lives of other people in the activity that it's doing. So you don't have to make up for it by doing something else in addition. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it. So, BB&T is part of the sponsor for this program. John Ellison used to be the CEO of BB&T and has said to me and others, he says this in speeches, that BB&T engages in a lot of philanthropy. And one reason they do that is because they think that actually improves the society for both the business and the people that are in that society. It's a mutually beneficial activity. That's great. And describing it in that way, which is a good and I think defensible and in fact an admirable thing to say. But I do take your point, and I think there's something important there. A lot of the business professors who advocate CSR, corporate social responsibility, they do so on the grounds, they say, so if you read their papers, the published papers, what they do is they say, this will benefit your bottom line. Okay, that may be true, but that's not what people outside of business think you mean by corporate social responsibility. They think you mean, we're going to take a moral stance regardless of what it does to our bottom line. And that's not the way that that's often portrayed, and I think that does run into the problem you're pointing to, which is not being fully honest about what you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, sir.
Hey, I was wondering, for the people that aren't in business specifically, obviously it's important for us to know that there's honorable goals in business.
Yeah.
But for those that aren't in business at all,
Yeah.
How important is it for them to realize that same fact? And what would that affect? How would that affect the business industry? And at the same time, are we doing anything currently? Is there something we could do currently for those people that don't have anything to do with business?
Yeah, so it's a fair question. Here's what I would say, though. Not everybody's a business major, obviously, or is going to start a business or something. But virtually whatever you study or whatever field you go into, you're going to have to deal with business. Whether you go into the government or charity or any field, you're going to work for businesses, partner with businesses, spend the money that businesses give away charitably. So if you work at a university, where do you think the money from university spend comes from? Ultimately from business. So in some way or another, you're still going to deal with business. So I think that makes it very important to not just have a view about what business is or what markets or commercial society is from the outside as if you're opposing it or standing outside of it, but actually try to understand it from the inside and see, warts and all, what exactly it is. So I think it's very important in fact, I think it should be part of a general liberal arts curriculum, some kind of introduction to markets and business. Everybody should know something about business. Economics is one of those things where, we all have opinions about economics, even when we don't know anything about it. Which is an interesting fact, isn't it? I mean, almost everybody in America has an opinion, for example, about whether the mandatory minimum wage should be raised or not. Yet almost nobody's actually looked at the empirical research that has been, and there's a lot of it, but we don't look at it, but we still have opinions about it. That's a mistake, and that's a mistake for an important social reason, I think, which is that just divides people, because then you get people who have their opinions and don't want to talk to people who do research about it, and the people who do research about it don't want to talk to the people who have their opinions, and it just divides us. So I think it's much more important for us to say business is part of our lives. It's a part, one way or another. Whatever you go into, you're going to be dealing with business in one way or another. So having an informed opinion about what business does and having some knowledge about from the inside of how it behaves, what it does, and then also bringing in whatever your own field of expertise is, I think that's the best of all possible worlds.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
I have one last question.
Oh, only one question. Okay. All right. Sorry. Yes. Talking to her. Go ahead.
Okay, all right.
All right.
So,
This is the big one. All right.
yes.
Go ahead. Yes.
I want to change your example with Jack and Jill just a little bit and see
Okay.
how that might affect your opinion about it.
Okay.
So suppose Jack and Jill were engaged.
Oh, yeah.
So he had
He'd already asked her, and she said yes?
promised these things to
Yeah.
each other. I guess what my problem with that is how moral luck can affect our ability to reach eudaimonia, even if it's something we can't control, like bad luck or whatever. So isn't that why we have things such as reliance damages, expectation damages in law?
Yes.
Could that same principle be applied to non-businessy areas of our life, you think? So like if somebody was, isn't that the whole goal for bettering society? Like we recognize that people may not have that head start to reach that flourishing life, so we try to come in and help those people.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's your suggestion for how we address the people who do have bad luck other than just outright compensation? How do we fix the underlying issue there?
Okay, so it sounds like you have a couple of different questions. The Jack and Jill issue about contract, and then how do we help people who need help?
Everything.
Okay. Well, let me say something about, I can say something quickly or about the first part of what your question about Jack and Jill. What if they had they had an arrangement? So keeping one's word, that does involve justice. Now, if you have a contract or a promise, sometimes even an implicit promise, although that requires a little bit of judgment, but that's a different story. So I mean, when I gave my scenario, they hadn't actually agreed on anything.
So they don't owe each other anything?
Right. So there's no agreement or promise like that. If you have an agreement or promise, then it's different. So if BB&T says, yes, we're going to hire you, and they sign a contract, and after you sign the contract and you say no to your other offers, and then they say, sorry, we're going away,
yeah,
then that's a different scenario. Am I right? I mean, then you have to do you got to make you whole in some way. We have to indemnify you in some way. So that's a different kind of case. So I agree with you on that. The question about how to help people who need help, especially people who are suffering from bad luck. One of the things to keep in mind is that, I would say just as a general claim, is that it's never the case that everybody suffers only bad luck or only good luck. So luck tends to be relatively distributed across people's lives, and there are periods in people's lives when they have better luck and worse luck. That doesn't make it go away. That doesn't mean it's any less not a person's fault to have good luck or bad luck. But I would say that's one of the principal things, the principal targets for individual moral responsibility. Meaning, if you see somebody who has had some bad luck or who has suffered in some way or is in a bad situation, and you can help in such a way that you know that the help you want to give would actually be helpful and not counterproductive or something, then the obligation to help is yours. It's an individual obligation. That's what we should do. So we absolutely should. And sometimes maybe we should partner together, you and I together, or we get a group of people who are going to help because here's a problem we can solve. One of the difficult things, and I would say nearly impossible things to do, so if you have the idea, I want to solve global poverty, never going to happen. That's not the sort of thing that a person can solve. But what you could do is find a problem and address it. And that requires local knowledge, meaning you have to know something about the actual person or people involved. It requires some actual sacrifice on your part. But that is absolutely part of a moral life. One of the indirect benefits of the honorable business stuff that I was talking about, if honorable business leads to increasing prosperity overall, which there's a lot of evidence that it does, if it does, that means there's more resources that we have at our disposal for exactly these sorts of problems. So when we see people who need help, we have more resources that we can use to help them. And I think it is part of a moral life to engage in exactly that activity.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's thank Jim one more time. Thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
It's very good.
Thank you.